Okay, looks like we're now live. Welcome everyone to week 3 of the office hours for Intro to ABM. Have a couple of live participants on the air already, so I want to just say hi to Jerry and Alberto, who are already joining us. We have a couple more later. I do want to, yeah, it always takes a few minutes for the viewers to chime in, so I do want to kind of spend some time doing some announcements, which I will, these will be here for those who are watching on the YouTube primarily. But just a couple quick notes. Unit 2 went live Sunday night, so for those of you who've paid tuition or you have one of the scholarships, you should be able to see that content right away. Unit 1 test, unfortunately, just because of a small mistake on my part, didn't actually go live till Friday night, but it should be up there and should be possible. Right now, it has no deadline on it, but I'm probably going to put a deadline on it eventually after I see how many people are taking it. And in general, the deadline for each of the tests will be roughly 1 to 2 weeks after the test is released, just to kind of make sure everyone's keeping up on pace and staying along with the course. For those who so at this point, by the way, I just want to make sure everyone's clear and on the same page. Unit 1 was freely available to everyone. The way this is going to work is that Unit 2 and the subsequent units are only available for those who pay the tuition at the time of the units being released. And if you want to get a certificate and everything like that, then you have to go ahead and pay the tuition. Quite honestly, the Santa Fe Institute and Complexity Explorer are making almost no money on this. They're in fact losing quite a bit of money. This is just a way to somewhat defray some of the costs that they have in this case for all the bandwidth of hosting everything and everything along those lines. So if you feel compelled, just go ahead and throw the money their way, and you'll get access to all the content as it goes live. One other small note: there seemed to be an interesting discussion that was happening on the forums about the project, and I just wanted to mention. Some people were asking, like, do we need to have like an intense research question that we really want to answer, or what's the kind of goal of the project, right? And basically the idea is, I personally feel that you don't really learn material unless you actually participate in the exercise of building something with that material and actually go through that process. So the project is really there to engage you enough that you really learn the material that's available to you, right? And so to that extent, it doesn't have to be a project that you think is like some earth-shattering discovery about the world. It can just be something that you personally are interested in and want to play around with a little bit, right? And so to that extent, I highly encourage people who are just interested in learning agent-based modeling for the sake of learning to go ahead and continue on with the class. Come up with some random question about the world that you've always wondered about, and work on a project in that space. I feel like, and this actually, speaking of which, this comes a little bit from Seymour Papard's thinking, and that's what inspires this in many ways, and his constructionist mindset, which basically was this idea that you need objects that you're creating to think with, right? And so building a model is an object to think with. Seymour unfortunately passed away just a couple of weeks ago, but he really kind of, in many ways, this course would not be possible without him, since he invented the logo programming language, which is what NetLogo is based upon, and one of the reasons why it's easy to teach agent-based modeling in this format. So just a quick sum, I highly recommend, doing the project. The questionnaire, I've also had some questions about that, what we're going to do with that. Obviously, there are now 2,000 people enrolled in the class, over 2,000 people. I don't have time to look through each and every one of those, but what we are going to do is kind of run some analysis on kind of what kinds of topics people are kind of focusing on, and try to get some understanding of that so that we can tailor the course material appropriately for that. And then we're also going to try and see if there's particular questions that people are struggling with. And also try and tailor the course material for that. So unfortunately, I won't be able to provide individualized responses to all the surveys, but we are using that material. And the other benefit of filling out that survey is not for me, but for you. I find that the process of working through that questionnaire is something I often do when building a model, and it helps engage you in the process of model building and helps you to become a little more concrete about the model that you're trying to build. And so to that extent, it's kind of a formal exercise that helps you think through the model development process. So that was just a couple of quick notes. And Unit 2.1 to 2.3 is now live. I should be putting the finishing touches on the rest of Unit 2 tonight, and so I hope to make sure that that's available tomorrow at the latest. You may see some parts of it go up tonight. And then from there on out, the units should be going up in their entirety basically the weekend before the week starts, essentially. So Unit 3 will go up this weekend sometime, and so forth, and we'll just continue on along in those fashions. And there will always be a test at the end of every unit, and there will almost always be a small project development section during the unit, right? That will help you work on the project a little bit. Okay. So that is the main. Those are the main announcements I wanted to make for this week. And so at this point, I'm happy to open up to any questions. I am, as always, I will be monitoring the Twitter feed at Intro to ABM, so if you send a question there, I will see it. I'll also be looking at the Q&A app on the Google Hangouts, and so I'll also answer any questions there. I didn't have any questions sent in ahead of time this time, but I did. You're also free to email me questions ahead of time as well. That actually does bring me down to one other point, actually, because I just mentioned the Q&A app. Google Hangouts, it turns out, Google, for those of you who have been following the news, Google announced this week that Google Hangouts on Air will no longer exist as of September 12th. But YouTube Live will continue to exist. As far as I actually investigated both when I was deciding what to use. Google Hangouts I decided just because it's easier to use than YouTube Live, but we'll just switch over to YouTube Live. We can make that work. It's not a big deal. So sometime in September, we will be forced to switch to YouTube Live instead of Google Hangouts on Air. Shouldn't be a big problem at all, but it's just. I was just using this one because I found it easier to set up, essentially. But the other one, but YouTube Live is not difficult to set up, and a lot of the same functionality will be migrating over to that as well. So yeah, so that's about it. And at this point, let me welcome again Jerry and Alberto, and if one of you has a question, I'm happy to start talking. We can start discussing a little bit of what's going on. Jerry, do you have something, interesting question, thought?
Sure. Yeah, the project, and again, is this volume okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Right, okay, good. Hey, the project I put together, it's I'm working kind of separately with the programs to reduce bias, like unconscious bias training programs, and we're working with Carnegie Mellon, and we're starting to roll it out to universities. So I put in my project of sampling a sample, like a model, a specific model of a specific instance of unconscious bias, where someone would say, and a classic example is, where are you from? So if I was talking to someone who had an accent from a different country, where are you from? And even if the answer is Chicago, you say, well, where are you really from? It turns out it's loaded and there's lots of stuff. So I was thinking of that specific case, but just like you said, the questionnaire is great for developing the thought, how would I do this over time and things like that. Is that the appropriate scale? I'm thinking, should I go bigger or keep it tight like that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, which is what scale should you work for the project, right? And I think and we'll really get into this in Unit 4 when we really start about how to design an agent-based model. But often what I try and do when considering questions of scale is think about what is the scale that is going to be the smallest scale that I can build that will help me understand the main question of interest, right? And so a lot of times that is actually a particular instance, right? Coming up with a particular instance. And then once you've developed that particular instance, once you've developed a model of that particular instance, then you can start to think about, well, how can I relax some of the specific parameters of this in order to generalize it to a more general case, right?
Okay.
So I highly recommend, think about, fairly concrete, fairly specific examples, but at this, and this is somewhat, kind of trying to make you think in two ways at the same time, but, always be considering, like, if I want to generalize this, how would I generalize it? But I think starting with the specific case is very important because that really helps you to flesh out details of the model, right, and to kind of think about the exactly what you're going to put in, right? Because too often you're like, well, it could happen this way, or it could happen that way, or it could happen this way, and you're like, you wind up actually trying to put too much into the model,
Right.
And an agent-based model. Well, I believe modeling in general, but agent-based modeling in particular. The old phrase that you'll hear that was I think mentioned by Bob Axelrod at one point is keep it simple, stupid, right? So, keep the model as simple as possible, and that's a great design principle. So yeah, starting with a specific instance I think is great. Trying to think through how that would affect an agent-based model. And I love the example. There's a lot of the bias example, much like the Schelling model, right? Is one of these models where it's something that we don't really know exactly what people are doing and how they're making these decisions, right? Like, even if you ask people, a lot of times the answers they're going to give you are not going to match up with reality and actual patterns of behavior.
Right.
So I think agent-based modeling is very appropriate for that context because essentially you can hypothesize a bunch of different ways people might act in those scenarios, and then you can kind of let those scenarios play out to see what will happen. Actually, I have a joint project with a colleague at Kellogg at Northwestern, Ned Smith, and we're looking at kind of hidden biases in hiring practices, and not how that would affect the focal firm, like the firm that is actually doing the hiring, but how it might affect other firms that are using information about what people are paying for hiring to make their own decisions, right? And so again, it's a very similar case where like we don't exactly know what people are doing, but we can say if people are making decisions in this way, that's what the potential ramifications of that system are. So.
Well, how does that tie? Okay, so let me go back to a question that I saw recently about knowing the agent interaction behaviors is important when you're setting up the model, knowing the inner agent type of things, rather than knowing. I guess the reason is at the system level, the aggregate level,
right.
You want that to play out. That's why you're building the model.
Right.
Kind of see where it plays. But you really need to know something about the agent-specific interactions.
Right. Right. So you don't. So this is why I always try and say this, and I apologize if I say this incorrectly at times. You don't need to know exactly the agent interactions. You need to have some belief or theories about the low-level agent interactions, right?
Okay.
So, and I make that distinction just because there are certain approaches where people are agnostic to the individual level roles, right? And they just try and make decisions about group level behavior, right?
Yeah.
and in those contexts, how can I put this? I'm just saying that in agent-based modeling, at least, you need to at least have a hypothesis about the individual level of behavior, right? And so knowledge in this case is kind of not a factual knowledge, right? It is a theoretical construct, a belief about the way the world works, right?
Okay.
And so I always try and make that clear that I'm not talking about like I know for a fact that this is the way individuals behave. It's more like a theory about the way individuals behave.
Cool. Okay, great. That clears it up. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Alberta, how are you doing today?
I'm great, thanks, Bill. Enjoying very much. I'm now very curious about Jerry's model. That sounds like a really cool application that I had never dreamed that you could use agent-based modeling from. Maybe I'll tester him at some point. Sure. Okay, as to the beginning of this unit, well, I mean, it's basically homework. It needs to be done. We need to be learning the basics of NetLogo, so not much to say about that, except NetLogo, you know, if anybody's interested in an outsider's opinion, seems really great. I mean, I really like this elegant architecture by procedure in which procedures call each other. It's really intuitive, and it looks like it might be very good value for effort. So great about that. I also have another one of my questions about how can you tell if, but maybe I'll save it not to pester the others with my own obsessions.
Well, feel free to chime in at any time on those questions. Thanks for the comments on NetLogo. Actually, that brings up an interesting point that, you know, a lot of times, and I didn't want to go into too much detail on this in the actual lectures, because this can get a very hotly debated topic as to, you know, what is the best way to build your model. And we talked a little bit about this last week in office hours, I think, when someone wanted to build their model in Python, right? The truth of the matter is that I've worked in a lot of different languages out there. I haven't actually worked in Mesa, which is the Python one, but I have worked in Mason, and I've worked in Repast, and I've worked in Swarm, which, you know, was in some ways the original agent-based modeling language. And I've written my own agent-based modeling code before in C++ and Java as well, right? I think one thing that you said, Alberta, I just want to highlight, is that, you know, all differences aside, I think one thing that's undeniable about NetLogo is it is the quickest way to get a model up and running, right? Like, even if you're just going to use it to prototype a model that you plan to later build into a high-performance computing language of some sort, right? It's a great way to get started because you can get that model up and running in almost no time at all, right? And you know, and the argument I always make is that computational time right now is pretty cheap, and the truth of the matter is that my time is somewhat expensive, and your time is somewhat expensive, and so in the end, even if NetLogo code runs slower than some of these other languages, and there's been some studies that show that it actually doesn't run that much slower. I'm willing to pay that cost because I'd rather take less time on development side of things and spend more time on the computational side of things. But yeah, well, I mean, I'm happy to talk about your question, Alberto, as well. Your question about how to match patterns of behavior.
Okay, so if there is time, the question is this. I have noticed from your examples and other examples that have been floating around that a lot of time when you're doing agent-based modeling, what you're really looking for is some kind of qualitative difference or phase transition or whatever. It's not really about the exact value of the parameters returned by the model. It's more about, hey, there's a big difference here. There's something important going on. So I was wondering if you could take us through at some point, maybe not now, but at some point it would definitely be interesting, to take us through a repertoire of techniques for detecting this kind of thing? Because again, I go back to my old to my question of last week. At the end of the day, when you're writing a paper, you're going to have to do some statistical testing to prove that what you claim is true. Or maybe not. Maybe with some words you can actually put up some plots, and people will say, "Hey, this is evident. This plot is different from that plot." But I doubt it.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, how do agent-based modelers go about this?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great question. And let me be as specific as I can be. So first of all, yes, we will be talking about this, and we will be talking about some very basic methods in this space in Unit 6, probably, which is the analysis section. We'll actually talk a little bit about it in Unit 4 as well, when we talk about the building construction of an ABM from the ground up. The truth of the matter is, though, that I actually think that this is a field that is still in development, right? And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of statistical methods out there that people are using to understand the results of agent-based models. And there's a lot of graphical methods people are using to understand the results of agent-based models. Unlike many traditional fields, such as econometrics or something like those, there is not a standardized set of, well, you first apply this method, and then you apply this method, and then you apply this method, right? Those don't exist. But I think the way you're phrasing it, Alberto, makes a lot of sense. There is a suite of methods that people have applied in this case in the past. And I do think that will be an important part of taking ABM to the next level. In fact, I've been trying to pitch this idea to some of my fellow researchers for a while. I think now that we have a couple of textbooks on ABM, the one that I did with Uri among them, right? The next real book that ABM needs is what I would call kind of an advanced methodology book or a analysis book that essentially does exactly what you're saying, where it lays out, here is from simple to complex methods of analyzing and looking for interesting patterns of behavior in agent-based models. That book hasn't been written yet, to my knowledge. If someone knows a good example, the topic is covered in many of the agent-based modeling books that are out there, but it's not covered by itself. It's covered as a unit or a section of a greater book. And I think the ABM is finally getting to the point where having a book just on that topic would be useful to look at. Yeah, so units 4 and 6, and I'll try and beef up the coverage especially in Unit 6, because that's the more advanced methods than what I was originally planning to go on based upon the interest that we've seen so far in the course on that topic. And like I said, I hope to write that book someday, but or at least edit that book. I don't know if I could write that book, but I could maybe edit it with some other people. But that book's not done yet, basically, is the answer to your question to some extent.
Well, that does link to that whole restructuration of knowledge. I mean, I love the way in the introduction, the way that's positioned, because I have been dabbling in ABMs a little bit for a while and kind of looking at it, but you guys really encapsulated that nicely. Is that gaining traction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the bigger restructuration that's going on vis-a-vis complex systems thinking, right? ABM is one part of that. And I think you're seeing this in other ways that maybe Uri and Mitch Resnick and others hadn't originally foreseen, Uri especially hadn't foreseen, which is that, since Uri has done most of the work on the restructuration, is that I see this playing out in a weird way. It's essentially a lot of the modern approaches to understanding complex problems are coming about through these kind of data science approaches, right? And in some ways, a lot of these data science methods are not using traditional statistical learning methods, right? But are instead using computational methods that are essentially what are sometimes called generative models, and I would call ABM a form of generative modeling, right? And the goal behind generative modeling, right, is really that you hypothesize a basic model that generates the data that you're seeing, as opposed to modeling the data in situ, right? Modeling the data as it is. And so to that extent, I do think that that restructuration is occurring. I don't think it's necessarily occurring just because of agent-based modeling, if that makes sense. I think it's occurring because people are realizing that really, if you want to understand complex systems and the way the world works, you have to understand these low-level patterns of behavior and phenomenon, right? And in fact, I do a lot of work now in data science, right? And part of the reason why is because of the fact that the methods that and the way I've thought of, that we've developed the thinking about complex systems problems are very applicable to a lot of data science type problems as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what was interesting too, and I hadn't realized before, and you mentioned that, I'm sure we'll get into it later, the interlinking that you can do, the dynamic systems analysis or machine learning that we can, and again, it sounds like later in the course we're going to get into that, of actually tying those together, complementary.
Yeah, and I mean, I try and emphasize this as much as possible. A lot of people, maybe it's mainly academics who are, I think I've spent enough time in the industry to see this as well there. People have their hammer that they want to use, and they believe that no other tool anyone has can possibly work as well as their hammer. And so I constantly try and emphasize that agent-based modeling is not a replacement for any of these other methods or techniques. It's a complement in many cases, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not willing to say that there aren't scenarios where people are quite frankly using the wrong tool, right? And that agent-based modeling or some other form of modeling isn't a superior replacement. I think that definitely exists. There are Pareto optimal solutions at times, but in general, I do believe in agent-based modeling more as a complement. And one of the nice things about agent-based modeling is that because it is more of a framework and mindset of how you're going to approach a problem rather than a particular set of do this, then that, then this, then that, it's very integrative, right? And by that I mean you can often combine it with these other methods. So,
right,
yeah.
Right.
And hopefully we'll see that. I definitely plan on talking about integration of agent-based modeling with machine learning, which is something that I've done quite a bit. Integration of agent-based modeling with GIS systems, which is also something I've worked in, network science, and system dynamics modeling to some extent. I gotta admit, the system dynamics one is probably the area I'm the weakest on, but I do, I've at least played around in that space somewhat to understand what's going on there. But the other three I've published multiple papers in, so that's much easier for me to discuss.
Perfect. Okay, that sounds fascinating. Yep.
So we do have a couple questions that have come in. So one question is from Edward Crude, who asked, is there a way to search the ABM field to see if ABM questions we want to explore have already been studied? And yes, and so yes, there is. There's a number of different ways. I wouldn't say there is one way that you can just search all the agent-based models that have been created. I highly recommend starting with three resources. The NetLogo Models Library, and when you pull up the NetLogos Model Library, you can actually search the Models Library, and that search functionality actually searches the entire text of the model, not just the name and the description. So if you type in a particular word and that word is mentioned anywhere in the description of the model, it will pull that up, right? So that's the number one place I usually start. The second is that there is something now called the Modeling Commons, and the Modeling Commons is kind of you can almost think of it as like a GitHub for NetLogo models. And you can get to it. Actually, I can show you. Let me just bring up my latest version of NetLogo. And you can get to it directly through the NetLogo app, right? So in NetLogo, when you, let's see, okay, so yeah, okay, so let me do a screen share real quick. Okay. So in, can everyone see that now? Does it look okay? NetLogo? Okay. So in NetLogo, oh, actually it might not show up because of the way the screen share works. But let me see. Flip this around. Minimize this stuff. The screen share either shows a window or everything. So let me just flip it around and show everything instead. Okay. That's a little freaky on you at first, but then it should be okay once I minimize this. Okay. So in screen share, I should keep that open. In screen share, sorry, in NetLogo, when you open the NetLogo, when you go up to the command line and you open a NetLogo file, there's a button that says Upload to Modeling Commons. If you do that, it will then ask you to type in an address and your password. And then once you do that, it will actually upload the file directly to the Modeling Commons. You can actually go directly there yourself by just typing in NetLogo Modeling Commons, and it will go directly there. And it's modelingcommons.org, right? Let me stop that just so it stops doing that. So it's modelingcommons.org, and now I can share just that window, and it should work a little bit better. There we go. Okay. And on that page, right? Oh, I've already logged in. That's good. And so it shows you all the different models that people have built and they're willing to share. And you can download any of these models. So you can click on a model. This is food chain with a 10% energy rule, for instance. You can run the model in NetLogo Web. You can grab the code of the actual model, and you can play around with the model. You can even suggest changes to the model. You can discuss the model, things along those lines. And so you can also search any of the models that are out there. So for instance, if I'm interested in bias, right, I can search for models that discuss bias in one form or another, and kind of look through them. And kind of explore what's going on. Looks like most of these are more on the bias, not the social bias that we were discussing earlier today, but rather on the kind of learning bias. Those were in the tag name, but if we look in the info name, some of these might be getting closer to it, right? Well, yeah, like awfully people choosing to make friends with people similar to them, right? So there's definitely some social influence. There's definitely some here that might be discussing bias in that sense of it, right? So those are the first two resources, especially, and those will give you the best access to NetLogo models. The third resource that I highly recommend, and just caveats aside, I am on the steering committee for this organization, is an organization called OpenABM.org, right? And OpenABM has another repository. Now, OpenABM is not like the NetLogo Modeling Commons or the NetLogo Modeling Library, because everyone, and so any kind of model can be uploaded that's an agent-based model, no matter what language it's written in at all, right? And so this just is currently, looks like it's a weird organization, because it looks like it's maybe based upon the, I don't know what date, maybe the most recent activity is when it's, title is what it's searching on right now, right? But you can see, for instance, what the most recent ones that were being submitted in, things along those lines. And again, you could go up and you can just search for models that are on particular topics. So, I just searched for bias, and again, I'm seeing different types of models that have included the word bias within them. Most of these seem to be focused on peer review. Now, the OpenABM not only has models, but it also has events and what are called book pages and other things that provide content for you as well, right? And so this is a great resource for people who are interested in agent-based modeling in general. So conferences get announced on OpenABM, right? Other things along those lines. It's probably, at this point, I would call it probably the premier hub for agent-based modeling information in general. NetLogo obviously is a great place to get information about NetLogo in particular and the NetLogo associated resources, right? But OpenABM is really about the general ecosystem of agent-based modeling. Finally, and I feel like I'd be remiss not to say this, right? But the last place I always start my search to find out if someone's building an agent-based model in that space is I go to Google Scholar, and I find Google Scholar to be a great resource here, right? I just type in agent-based in quotes often, and then I type in whatever particular area I'm interested in looking at. But yeah, those are, I highly recommend starting your search with NetLogo itself, branching out to OpenABM, and then to the modeling is common, and then go on from there. So I hope that answers your question. Ed, I see that you are also on Twitter, so if you have a follow-up question, feel free to shoot me a question there as well. Okay. So let's see. So there was one other question, also from Edward. For the R section of the course, is there a textbook on R that we will be using, or is there a textbook you would recommend for a true beginner in R who does have other programming experience? So, the R section is not, I mentioned R just because it's the one other piece of software we're going to be using. It's not going to be used extensively through the course. It's primarily going to be used in the same units we talked about when we talked about analysis of agent-based models. So units 4 and unit 6. It may come in a couple other places, but those are the primary places where it's going to be used. Each of those cases, I honestly think R has some built-in tutorial resources. I think that for what we're doing in the course, even those built-in tutorial resources will probably be enough. So if you do this again properly this time, so if you bring up R once you've installed it, okay. Okay, so if you bring up R once you've installed it, and I'll just share that with you right now. There we go. Okay. Then, okay. Then, and you go up to help. You go up to help, and you go to R help. There's actually some kind of nice little, just kind of quick definitions in there. There's an introduction to R. Things along those lines. There's also what are called the vignettes, right? And these vignettes are just to kind of get you some exploration of particular packages. So if there's some particular package you're interested in, that will provide you some definition and some examples of how to use it. If you actually want a actual textbook, or a book along those lines, I highly recommend, the place I always start when it comes to technical manuals for myself is the O'Reilly books, and they have a pretty good one called Learning R that I've used before, and it's a great introductory book. So let me see, I'll just pull it up on my website and then share that, my browser, and share that with you. So, yeah. So, this is the Learning R it's a step-by-step function guide to data analysis. If you want a real textbook, that's probably the way to go. But I do, R is one of those because it's very popular among data scientists and among statistical analysts right now. There's tons of online web resources for this also, right? So honestly, if you have any questions about R, that's a great place to go. Oh, and for both, actually, to answer both the NetLogo question and to answer the R question, one place I highly recommend is Stack Overflow. And Stack Overflow, for those of you who don't know, is a kind of question and answering website for programmers, essentially. And there are specific questions that have been tagged with R and NetLogo tags. So you can actually find specific resources on NetLogo or on R in here. So there are 1,600 questions on NetLogo that have been asked, and not all of them answered, but some of them have been answered. And so if you have particular questions about either NetLogo or R, I highly recommend going to Stack Overflow as another resource to find answers, right? So R has about 10 times more questions than NetLogo, right? And most of the time when I am kind of struggling with what to show for R, or struggling with a particular problem in R, this is the first resource I go to in terms of solving the questions. So yeah, so I hope that answers your questions, Edward. If you have any more, let me know. Thanks for joining in on those questions. Any more questions out there? Alberto or Jerry, or I see Alberto likes the NetLogo Modeling Commons. He put a tweet out already on that, so go ahead. Good to hear. Yeah, I honestly, the NetLogo Modeling Commons. So Reuben Lerner, who was a PhD student in the NetLogo project, that in many ways was that's his dissertation, and that was his idea, right? Was really to kind of put this all together, the Modeling Commons, and I think it's a phenomenal idea. I think if we can kind of build a strong community around it, right, and through this course and through others like it, that will start to happen. I think it'll be a great place for people to exchange ideas, kind of share resources about models that they're working on, and kind of build things up. So I highly recommend going over to the Modeling Commons, checking it out, and kind of taking a look at it and seeing if there's something in there. So, any other questions?
Yeah, are there any particular conferences that you like, or that are, tops in the area?
Yeah, so there's a couple of them that are particular to agent-based modeling that I'll mention. One is probably the biggest world-wide conference. I got to get the name right because they just changed it. It used to be called the World Congress on Social Simulation. So this is specifically on the social side. It wasn't an agent-based modeling in general. I think it's now just called something like the Congress on Social Simulation. I'll send out a URL to it. I know Flaminio Spazzoni is hosting it. Let's see if I can pull it up quickly. And it's social it's now called the Social Simulation Conference. It's on ABM. I should have just gone there. Yeah, let me share the screen. So this is a conference that's coming up. It's going to be in Rome in September, so it might be a little too late for anybody to get over to it. But that is probably the biggest single conference on this topic, and it's usually been pretty good. Other conferences along this line, and I bet I can find a lot, now that I think about it, I can probably see most of these on OpenABM. So I know that the Swarm Fest just ended, and that was an older conference that had been around for a while, and it's still going on. It's probably the oldest Asia-based modeling conference. It used to be focused primarily around the topic of Swarm, which was a particular modeling language, but not that many people use that language anymore. So now it's actually kind of grown to be a general Asia-based modeling conference. That one is meant to be a very low-key event where people just kind of get together and discuss Asia-based modeling. It's almost more like almost more like a con in the terms of like a Comic-Con or something like that than it is an academic conference, where it's really kind of an emphasis on just how can we play around with this, and how can we work with these kind of methods. Right? The other ones coming up, and one was mentioned on the calendar, is the CSSSA. So the Social Simulation Conference is kind of the worldwide conference on social simulation. CSSSA is the North American conference on social simulation, computational social science, right? And that's held, it has been, at least for the last few years, has been held in Santa Fe every year. And that conference is coming up in November down in Santa Fe. So those are both great. Those are all great conferences. There is another larger conference that kind of includes a large section on agent-based modeling, which is probably the largest in the space, which is AMOS, which is the Autonomous Agents and Multi-Agent Systems Conference. That conference is quite large. Most of the work there is on engineering of multi-agent systems. In other words, not modeling, but rather how do I specify the rules for a multi-agent system to get the performance that I want out of it. And we'll talk a little bit about that distinction later, but there's definitely a distinction in the community between engineering of multi-agent systems and using multi-agent systems for modeling, and those two communities are related but different, right? But there is some work at AMOS that is definitely more on the modeling side, and there is a and so trying to look forward. So I would highly recommend, those are some of the major conferences in this space. There is a small one I'm going to be involved with this year called the Duke Forest Conference, which will be happening in November, which is down here in the Research Triangle where I'm based out of. That one is more general than agent-based modeling, but will feature a lot of agent-based models in it as well, and that's going to be interesting. Oh, and this is not a conference that regularly occurs, but there will be a new conference this year that Rob Axtell and Josh Epstein are organizing to mark the 20th anniversary of their book, Growing Artificial Societies, Social Science from the Bottom Up, that in many ways was kind of the first agent-based modeling academic book, right? And so that conference is coming up at the end of November. Now this conference has never existed before, but I feel like it would be remiss for me not to mention that because it is kind of going to be a hallmark. And they have a phenomenal set of speakers and guests lined up, including Tom Schelling, who was at the University of Maryland, Brian Arthur. And Tom Schelling is the creator of the segregation model that we had played around with earlier in the course. Brian Arthur, whose L for All model we'll definitely be talking about. Michael Batty, who does a bunch of work on the intersection of geography and agent-based modeling. A lot of work on pedestrian modeling, for instance. And then David Krakauer, who is the president of the Santa Fe Institute, right? And of course, Rob and Josh's book is phenomenal, and they've gone on to do phenomenal work in Asia-based modeling. Both of them, Rob's at George Mason, which is where the conference will be held. Josh is now up at Johns Hopkins University. And so I highly recommend, if you're interested, the deadline for submission for that conference is coming up August 15th, if I remember correctly. And the conference itself will be at the very end of November. I think that'll be a phenomenal meeting. So,
wow, cool.
Maybe that's too many conferences, but it's kind of give you an overview of some of the major ones in this space, that's for sure.
Nice.
Any other questions out there? Okay, well, thank you all very much for participating in the third week of office hours. And I'll have the week for week 4 posted shortly. And the YouTube video will go live shortly as well. Just to kind of follow up with the announcements that I made at the top of the hour, I always like to recap them quickly. The important thing is that units 2.1 through 2.3 are now live. Unit 1 test is now live. 2.4 through the end of Unit 2, which will include the test, should be live in the next, say, 24 hours or so. Also, a quick reminder that if you want to continue on with this course, at this point, you got to pay the tuition to continue on with it live. But of course, the videos and the content, or the videos will be available post the course for anyone. And just the last thing is, stay involved with the project no matter what. Even if you don't have something that's like a dramatic research project, it's always fun to kind of pick something out and play around with it. And the last announcement is that sometime in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be switching off Google Hangouts to YouTube Live because Google is phasing out Google Hangouts on air. But that should be seamless. Shouldn't matter at all. I'll let you know about that as we go forward. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Good luck with Unit 2. Thanks, Jerry and Alberta, for joining in. And I look forward to talking to all of you next week. Take care.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye, thanks.